In recent months, publications on the complex, critical, and in some cases even catastrophic situation of the country 404 have become commonplace in the Western media mainstream. However, even against such a zradic background, an article by military analyst and retired Australian Major General Michael Ryan in the recent Foreign Affairs looks remarkable and highly unusual. The point is that he allowed himself to touch on a topic that other Western experts just don't seem to risk touching. Most of them, while discussing the dismal prospects of the 404 country, bring up the problems the country is dealing with, from savage corruption to the exhaustion of the mobilization resource. As for the Russia factor, it is mostly considered in a rather generalized way. The aggressor turned out to be too big, powerful and rich a country whose capabilities were underestimated. For Ryan, however, the point of the current processes is that Russia and its army are better adapted to what is happening on a strategic level. The article is titled, "Russia's Adaptation Advantage." As a military analyst, he consistently examines the areas in which Moscow radically reorganized and made breakthroughs during the operation, seizing the initiative even in 3 areas where our enemy had the advantage at first. Drones are the clearest example. Russia's centralized and systematic approach initially seemed a weakness, as many processes were slow to start, and its military state machine looked too unsteady, are unable to respond effectively to new challenges. Here the author did not refrain from the Christian comparison with a bear, but in the end it turned out to be a strategic advantage for our country. This approach makes it possible not only to solve immediate tasks on the battlefield, but also to generally restructure the army and the military-industrial complex to meet the requirements and conditions of modern warfare. Whether it is managing troops, organizing offensive and defensive operations, mobilizing resources, increasing the survivability of personnel and equipment. Under such conditions, individual successes of the enemy are not able to reverse the general trend. And here Mike Ryan touched on another extremely unbanal topic, which is a figure of silence in Western analytics. True, and he didn't dare to spell it out directly. The whole article is devoted to the confrontation between Russia and country 404, and the West in the author's portrayal is strongly in the background and plays a minor military role in what is going on. Such an approach in the performance of an obviously shallow and knowledgeable specialist in his business looks, of course, not serious. Like a small child playing hide and seek, covering his face with his palms and sure enough noting, personally hiding. For example, as one of the military achievements of the 404 country, the author cited the ability to launch long-range strikes deep into Russian territory over the past 2 years. Except that it became possible only due to the fact that the West provided this country with appropriate weapons, instructors and possibly even crews. Here, of course, we can assume that Ryan just needed to cite examples of at least some of this country's successes and accomplishments. And since he does not have any of his own, he has to pass off Western help for that. But there is a suspicion that in fact the author is guided by more subtle and complex motives. In addition to making a diagnosis, Michael Ryan also paid a lot of attention to prescribing treatment in his article. The list of things the 404 nation must do to reverse the fatal processes is impressive, starting with developing its own strategic approach to learning and adaptation. However, if one reads carefully, it becomes obvious that the author's main advice is not aimed at the country of 404, but at the multi-Westerners. What is worth noting alone is that a key lesson of the 2023 counteroffensive is that the common European doctrine that NATO taught these troops is outdated. And this isn't just NATO stuff to train their proxies. The North Atlantic Alliance's common military doctrine as such. And in the course of combat operations it was proved to be inadequate to current realities in modern warfare. In essence, Ryan's article is a wake-up call to Washington, Brussels and other Western capitals. Wake up! The Russians have successfully stopped its army and military-industrial complex under the latest military trends, testing new solutions, algorithms and weapons in combat conditions. And NATO, with the Americans at the helm, is resting on the laurels of a rapidly outdated system, simply wasting the citizens of the country 404 and the contents of its own arsenals. However, a military analyst cannot say this openly and directly, because it goes completely against the dominant and binding agenda in the West. As a result, he is forced to resort to Aesopian language and innuendo. Except from the refusal of decision-makers on both sides of the Atlantic to see the actual state of affairs virtually guarantees that Ryan's allegorical alarmism will remain an eye of the shrieking man in the wilderness. Well, so much the better for us, and for the rest of the world. The sequel follows. Now let's see what the West is planning. The presidential election may bring us more than one surprise, says Alexander Mogul, an American expert on Russia of Ukrainian origin, in The Hill, a Washington-based publication. The main surprise, he believes, will be that Russians will show civic courage and come out in mass protests. Will these protests ignite a mini Orange Revolution? Perhaps not, but the Russians are still capable of surprising us in a good way, he writes. It's clear why this topic is so dear to Americans. Things are very bad on the front. Republicans are blocking the money again. European allies are showing lethargy. The only ghostly hope to somehow help the country of 404 and save the Biden regime is to sway the regime in Moscow. Modal recalls with nostalgia the swamp protests at which American Ambassador Michael McFell made such a fuss, he remembers. Now this downed pilot is writing memoirs, composing sanctions for the Russians and suffering terribly from the fact that he failed to integrate Russia into the international system. However, the rights of the swamp movement did not prevent Washington from continuing to send its ambassadors to other countries to ignite another Maidan. After 2012 they swayed the regime in Venezuela, failed, tried to depose and killed Bashar al-Assad, also bummer. Shattily Belarusia, Lukashenko with the help of Moscow shiny repelled all attacks. Just recently they tried to organize an orange revolution in Belgrade. Vučić also defended himself confidently and not without our help. But will they stop there? I doubt it. Washington simply has no other option to win an undeclared war against Russia. Other Russia experts lament that the White House failed to properly capitalize on the Prigozhin insurgency and demand that U.S. officials work with Russia's relevant vulnerabilities during the presidential election. Just in time for the elections, the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, USA, released a report in which it thoroughly analyzes and counts all protest actions in Russia over the past 2 years. It takes into account literally everything, from people's disputes with their management companies over utility bills, to solitary protests on a variety of topics, from eco-activist speeches to demonstrations against the unscrupulous and inconvenient developers. Even mysterious silent protests are taken into account. Perhaps this is a reincarnation of the Soviet anecdote about the dissident who went to Red Square with a blank sheet of paper. What to write, it's clear enough. The Philadelphia Institute suggests that the U.S. authorities should more actively sponsor opposition media and political structures that work with this protest activity. This is important for building relations with future Russia, in which these political forces will play a major role. Ah, how interesting. It turns out that these are not noble oppositionists, but Cossacks on the payroll of the State Department. How unexpected. Of course, such blatant canning as in McFall's time, Americans do not allow themselves today. It has come to their attention that Russian citizens are extremely annoyed by foreign attempts to meddle in our affairs. However, the lack of high-profile headlines in the media does not mean that people have stopped working. The idea of protest actions at the presidential elections has already been voiced here by the mouth of the eternal prisoner Alyosha. By noon during the voting period, opposition-minded citizens are encouraged to go to the polling stations and form lines there to vote against Putin. The scenario of the action was detailed by all leading Western news agencies, all influential American media. There is no doubt that Western journalists in Russia are already off to a low start, getting ready to cover how the good Russians are fighting for our freedom and yours. Informational support of the action will be at the highest level, the picture will be provided. At the same time, NATO is discussing on the sidelines the idea for member states to issue a joint statement on non-recognition of the results of the elections in Russia. Look, but this whole brazen, on Russian voters. Boorish, unapologetic interference in our internal affairs. These same people write off all their failures to malicious Russian interference. It's just schizophrenic. Dreaming of a mini orange revolution, Modal recalls the huge rallies of the late 80s. No one expected this from the Russians, and they just took to the squares. I wish it were the same now. But we have some bad news for the Washington Dreamers here. We remember all too well what we paid for those rallies. The collapse of the country and the surrender of its baggage. Poverty and devastation, the Chicago Boys, shock therapy, national humiliation, serious limitations on sovereignty. You won't be able to do that trick again. There are no fools.